Good evening, everyone. I'm Daniel Mendelsohn, the editor-at-large of the New York Review of Books, and I'm delighted to welcome you this evening to a special edition of the New York Review Seminars. The NYRSeminars, now heading into its fourth season, is a series of courses on literary subjects, each series arcing over 4 or even 5 months, and each with its own theme. Journeys in our first season, which began with Homer's Odyssey, of course, tragic meaning in our second year, followed by drama queens last year, an examination of how the figure of the tragic heroine has evolved from Euripides to Tennessee Williams, and heading into our fourth season this September, Unrequited Love, which should be a lot of fun. You'll all be receiving an email with more information about the upcoming series after tonight's event. But tonight, of course, we're offering this special one-off evening devoted to encouraging and answering your questions about the Christopher Nolan adaptation of Homer's Odyssey, a text, as many of you know, that has special importance to me personally. As a classicist and translator of Homer, I've been absolutely astonished by the intensity of the global public reaction to Nolan's film. And I have followed with great interest the ongoing debates on both social and traditional media about the authenticity of its casting, the historical or textual accuracy or lack thereof of the armor, the ships, the accents, the diction, the nullification of Homer's text, and many other subjects. And so it occurred to us here at the New York Review that we could take this opportunity to provide a forum for answering your questions and comments, to which I look forward to responding. Ordinarily, when I conduct the New York Review seminars, I engage personally with the subscribers in conversation. But because of the size of tonight's audience, there are nearly 1,500 of you, we're going to be using the Q&A function on Zoom for you to submit your questions. The Q&A feature is located, for those of you who don't know, at the bottom of your screens. You can submit your questions at any time during the session tonight. We encourage you to upvote questions that you would like to have answered. So somebody might have posed a question that was the question you were going to pose, in which case you should upvote it. But we do ask that you refrain from adding any comments to the Q&A log, which will make it easier for our team to to sift through your questions more easily. Obviously, any irrelevant or inappropriate posts will be deleted. I can't imagine what those might be, but they told me to say that. And we'd also like to remind you that tonight's event is being recorded. All of you who have registered for tonight's event will be receiving via email a copy of the recording within 24 hours. Since we're very eager to host your questions and comments, and to give as much time as possible to you, I'm going to keep my own opening comments to a minimum this evening. I do have a lengthy review essay on Nolan's adaptation of the Odyssey, which will be appearing in the upcoming issue of the New York Review of Books. It's already available online to subscribers. But I thought for those of you who aren't yet subscribers, I would very quickly summarize some of my own thoughts as a prelude to engaging with yours. And as a final bit of housekeeping, I am told that I should remind you that everyone who has subscribed to tonight's event will be receiving a 25% discount on the recording of the 6-part New York Review seminar that I did last year on Homer's Odyssey, as well as on several of my books, which have been published by New York Review Books on classical and Homeric subjects. My book, Three Rings, which is about Homer's very distinctive circular narrative technique, and my 2 essay collections, Waiting for the Barbarians, Essays from the Classics to Pop Culture, and Ecstasy and Terror, From the Greeks to Game of Thrones. There will be a discount code in the chat, and it will also be emailed to you after tonight's event. So now on to Christopher Nolan's Odyssey. So just to summarize quickly, some of the major pros and cons that I wrote about in my review. It's actually a funny story. I was actually writing a review for the New York Review about 2.5 years ago of another Odyssey adaptation that had come out called The Return, featuring Ralph Fiennes and Juliette Binoche as Odysseus and Penelope. And as I was writing that piece, Christopher Nolan announced that he would be making his $250 million extravaganza. And my editor and I agreed that nobody was going to be reading two separate pieces on Odyssey adaptations. So I held fire until the Nolan. I was very excited to hear that Nolan would be directing it. Uh, I'm have enjoyed many of his films. I particularly found or hoped that his, the narrative technique for which he's well known is sort of braiding of different layers of narrative and different threads of chronology together into this interesting pattern was in fact ideally suited to the Homeric narrative technique, which moves between past and present, reminiscence and action. And so I was actually quite enthused. And I do think that as I wrote in my review, I think maybe the most authentic element of Nolan's film is that he has found visual equivalents for Homer's narrative technique, this sort of layering in within a scene of moments from the past and moment from the present and moving back and forth between them. I found very effective and very Homeric. Obviously, the picture is very visually impressive in certain ways. I was lucky because I got to see a press screening, which was in the full-on 70 millimeter IMAX format, which really does make a tremendous difference. And I thought there were certain scenes that benefited tremendously from this enormous large-scale format. I thought the Cyclops scene in particular was very effective. One really had the sense of being in this vast cave, which Homer describes in the Odyssey, in this inky darkness of the vast cave. I also think the sound design of the movie was very effective. I know a lot of people found it very loud, but there were moments where that served, and I thought the Cyclops episode was one of those moments. The storms at sea, I thought were remarkably well done. Homer devotes some of his really most fantastic descriptive passages to those storms, and I thought Nolan really captured the terror of being out on the open sea in a relatively small vessel to great effect. I thought, as many people did, that the Circe episode was marvelously done, very powerful, very scary. It was not Homer's Circe, but it was distinctive, and I think it made quite an impression. I thought certain of the performances were very effective. I admired Anne Hathaway, who I thought brought both dignity and emotionality to the role of Penelope, just as the character has in the poem. Samantha Morton's Circe is not the glittering goddess, the seductive glittering goddess of Homer, but she made it into a character and a very memorable one. I also quite like John Leguizamo as Eumaeus, one of my favorite characters in the Odyssey. I will say I was rather disappointed in Matt Damon's Odysseus. I admire Matt Damon as an actor. I often think he's more comfortable playing sort of oddball roles, characters who have strange secrets. I'm thinking of talented Mr. Ripley, even the sort of nerdy guy in the Ocean's 11 or 12 or 13, whichever one it was. Um, he can do sly, self-repressing, internally troubled characters. I think the role of Odysseus, and I'll come to this in a moment, was seriously underwritten and didn't give him a lot to deal with. I don't think any of the actors were given much to work with. You never really felt that the characters were developed through the writing. Which leads me to the cons. And the greatest con for me was the character of Odysseus. Nolan completely erases the character of Odysseus as he appears in the Odyssey. The Greek adjective polymetes, a man of great cunning. There is no sign of that man in this movie. The clever trickster, the smooth talker, the seducer, both erotic and verbal. Uh, Nolan has elided virtually everything about the character, everything that we love about the character, a very complex character in Homer, and turned him inevitably into a Nolan protagonist, which, but fine. The tormented, guilt-ridden warrior, like his Batman in the Dark Knight trilogy, who wants to atone for the destruction he has called, like Oppenheimer in Oppenheimer. So it's not an accident, given his preoccupations. I think that Nolan has eliminated every scene, every episode in Homer that is designed to spotlight Odysseus's charm, his emotionality, his tenderness at times, his wit, the famous cleverness. I thought it was quite telling that in the Cyclops episode, which in Homer is the longest of the adventures and the one that is most obviously designed to showcase the brilliant wit of Odysseus, Nolan elides all the material, the famous pun on the name Nobody, and some other elements that would have shown us a character who was more, had greater charm and humor. Nolan is not known for his sense of humor, which is too bad because the Odyssey is a text that is filled with humor in many ways. I also thought this relentless, the theme of Odysseus's guilt over the destruction of Troy. I mean, it certainly speaks to a modern day sensibility about war, but it twists the meaning of Homer's poem completely out of shape. Homeric warriors, although they do weep when they think about the past, and Odysseus certainly does quite a lot of that in the Odyssey, they don't feel guilty about their military conquests. Guilt is not an emotion that you see in this archaic world. And so Nolan's eagerness to turn Odysseus into a sort of victim of sufferer of PTSD, I think really distorts the story. Um, and I think possibly for me, the most troubling thing about the film is the way that Nolan has conflated two famous episodes of the original text, the Calypso episode and the Land of the Lotus Eaters episode, as I always say, the original potheads of Western literature. So the lotus eaters eat this flower, which makes them forget that they want to go home. And so in Nolan's film, Calypso is feeding Odysseus lotus flower, and so he's an amnesiac the entire 7 years that he is on her island. And this is a problem for me because, and it's interesting to me because Nolan in his earlier films is very interested in questions about memory. I'm sure many of you have seen Memento, which I thought was a remarkable film. And to turn Odysseus into an amnesiac inverts the whole meaning of the Odyssey because the whole point of the Calypso episode is that, I think quite movingly, Odysseus refuses the goddess's offer of immortality. She has fallen for him in a big way and offers to make him an immortal um, because he remembers that he has a home and a wife and that she is the one for him. So to sort of erase that, I think seriously twists the Odyssey. So that's basically all I'm going to say, except I do want to raise a larger question. I'd be interested to hear people's thoughts about this. So my complaints are not just, oh, I'm gatekeeping the Odyssey. I'm very interested, and actually over the past 25 years have written very often for the New York Review of Books, particularly about cinematic adaptations of literary works, from the Greek classics to The Hours and many other works. It does, I think, in an interesting forces us to think about what an adaptation is for and what the nature of an adaptation is. And I'll close these introductory remarks with the following observation, which is I think, I sort of wish Nolan had called his movie Odysseus or An Odyssey, although that title is already taken. Um, uh, because to call it the Odyssey sort of raises a series of expectations, I think not unfairly. And I think in the end, Nolan has sort of used the outlines of Homer's story and filled them with his own preoccupations and themes, violence, guilt, memory. That's totally fine. But what is the result in relation to its ostensible model or inspiration? So I made an analogy in a tweet the other day. I said, if you took made $100 million adaptation of Moby Dick, in which Ahab was now a jolly, soft-hearted old geezer adored by his crew who develops anguished qualms about the morality of the whale hunting industry. Would you call it Moby Dick? So with that question, I will now move to your uh, um, questions. So, the omission of the Phaeacians from, sorry, this is Kim. The omission of the Phaeacians from the film seems major, as it is the vehicle for Odysseus recalling his journey and experiences. Do you have any thoughts as to why Nolan would admit that? Well, it's an excellent question, and I think of the omitted episodes, Nolan covers a bunch of them and some of the best known, but there is this interlude from book 6 through book 12, actually, where Odysseus, the last place he lands before he finally gets home, is on in the land of these nice, civilized, human people called the Phaeacians, who are ultimately the ones who give him a ride back to Ithaca, sort of hyper civilized. They love dancing and music and sports. And as I mentioned before, I think Odys Nolan eliminates the stay in the land of the Phaeacians, which includes some of the most charming material in the Odyssey. So, it begins with Odysseus in book 6. He's washed up from Calypso's island. He's naked on the beach, and the Phaeacian princess Nausicaa has come down to the beach with her women to do the laundry and play volleyball, basically. And she finds him naked, and there's this wonderful exchange between them in which he's clearly trying to impress her in order to get help from her. She clearly has a crush on him. She takes him back to the palace. The king and the queen welcome him. There's a lot of business about the relationship between the king and the queen. The queen, like many of the female characters in the Odyssey, has greater power than the king. All of that has been wiped out. And I think the reason it did not appeal to Nolan is precisely because it provides a vehicle for displaying the qualities in Odysseus that Nolan is not interested in. You can't have a jolly, flirtatious, seductive Odysseus in the Nolan um, version. I think that's an excellent question. Alex asked, while the costumes are not historically accurate, amen to that, Alex. Do you believe that the costuming still fit the characters despite that? It's a very interesting question. I, I'm I'm actually not a stickler in general when I write about adaptation for those kinds of details. I think the point in a cinematic adaptation is to put across a sense of a culture. And in fact, I read a very interesting, or I saw Anne Hathaway being interviewed about her costumes. And you may have noticed that she has these wonderful sort of jewel-toned gowns and is always very elaborately bejeweled. And apparently, Anne Hathaway said to the costume designer, but I thought Penelope was this sad, widow who thought her husband is dead, and why isn't she schlepping around the palace in widow's weeds? And the costume designer uh, said that uh, she wanted Penelope to be dressed up every day as if each day might be the day that Odysseus returned, and therefore she had to look her best. And I thought that was a charming detail about the costumes. Overall, I'm sorry to have to say this, but in my review, I said that all of the costumes and sets looked like they had been rented from the Game of Thrones warehouse. I did find it rather drab. Um, I didn't mind that they're not accurate, whatever that means to the period, but I found them, with the exception of Penelope, for the reasons I just mentioned, I found them uninspired. I thought the look, despite the sort of optical impressiveness, so to speak, the look of the film I thought was dreary and not very imaginative. Um, uh, so Mark asks, did the ancient Greeks have as much ownership over their takes of the poem as much as we are seeing some modern translators feeling a kind of ownership and scathing others over their interpretations versus respecting that it's a shared story for us all? We won't mention any names. I think it's very important to remember that for the ancient Greeks, myth was elastic. There was no, as I always tell my students, the ancient Greeks did not have Edith Hamilton's mythology. There were no official versions of myths. So, for example, uh, there were, uh, sort of always alternate versions floating around. Certainly, the Greek tragedians took much of the material, mostly from the Iliad, rarely from the Odyssey, and bent it to their wills quite freely. So Euripides has a play called Helen, one of my favorite plays, which follows one of these alternative strands of myth in which Helen of Troy did not run away with Paris, a wanton hussy, but instead was always faithful to Menelaus, and it was a phantom Helen who ran away to Troy with Paris. The real Helen was stranded in Egypt, hoping that Menelaus would come rescue her. So I think the Greeks had quite a lot of fun with their own myths. There's a play by Euripides called The Phoenician Women, which takes up the Oedipus myth. And in this play, Jocasta has not hanged herself after the revelation of the incest, as she does in a play by Sophocles, the play we know as the Oedipus Rex, but is still, puttering around the palace afterwards. So I think it's very important to remember that the Greeks saw myth as a kind of playground, um, and you could sort of take bits and invent new bits, and so there was not gatekeeping, so to speak, among the Greeks themselves. Um, and I think that's worth keeping in mind. So I don't know, Mark, what particularly, all kidding aside, which translators you were referring to, feeling a kind of ownership. I think, as a translator myself, I don't think our stance with respect to the text is proprietary. I think you're sort of happy to be able to have a go at it, but I don't think translation is a competitive sport. Just as the Greeks played with these myths, there are many different approaches to translation. And, I'm sure we all have reservations about the way this, someone did this or that, but we bring to it our own vision of the text and you stick with that. So I think that's the best way to think about translation is the way that Greeks thought about their text, which is it's a sandbox and everybody can play in it. Um, Craig asked, was there any aspect of the film that prompted you, me, I guess, to rethink the text in some way? I can't say that it did. I mean, it did. As I was writing my review a couple of weeks ago, there were, as I mentioned before, strong themes of the film, which I think belong to Nolan. For example, this guilt theme, and that did, force me to think, is there a trace of that in the Odyssey? I've had very interesting discussions in the past week with people on Twitter about this point. People have argued that there are traces of guilt in the Odyssey, Odysseus breaking down into tears during the Phaeacian episode, for example, in Book 8. There is a grand banquet, and the court bard, a sort of Homer-like figure, is asked by Odysseus, in fact, to sing a mini epic about the Trojan horse episode. It's a very psychologically interesting moment because Odysseus has asked for this song, he's requested the song, so to speak, and then he bursts into tears as soon as he hears it. And some of the people I've spoken to have argued that this is an evidence of his guilt, the guilt that he feels for Troy. I don't see that in that passage. I think he's just overwhelmed by thoughts of the past. I don't think they're guilty. So there were things in the film that made me go back to the text, rethink it, think maybe there is a justification for this, maybe not. But I don't think my sense of the text is profoundly, uh, uh, changed by seeing the film. John S. has asked, Daniel, what is the biggest challenge in anglicizing the Odyssey for a 21st century audience? Um, well, unfortunately, we only have an hour tonight. I can talk on that subject for a very long time. I think the for me, the biggest challenge about rendering the Odyssey into English in the year 2026 is to find a happy medium between Homer's language, which is elevated, dignified, which sounded strange and archaic even to ancient Greeks, actually. It was not a language anyone ever spoke. It was a purely literary idiom uh, containing, uh, different Greek from different eras in the evolution of the language. And so it's a very odd mixture, but it is not normal speech, and it always sounded a little odd. I always make the analogy of the King James Bible. I think it sounded archaic to ancient Greeks, but it was also familiar to ancient Greeks, that wonderful paradox. And and so I think the challenge for me, and this is again just me, every translator has uh, their own priorities, right? To me, I wanted to find a register that was plain because Homer, even though it is this funny lingo, is very forthright. I wanted to find something that was plain in English, but didn't sound necessarily like I avoided slang. I avoided, except with one exception, contemporary idioms. So I think that for me was the biggest challenge is finding the right register. Um, Catherine C. asked, do you have thoughts about interpretations where Nolan is grafting his political anxieties onto the film? A previous status quo, a contemporary world broken by a forever war, and especially with the sea peoples. So there has been a lot of discussion. Look, this started when the trailer started to drop. And of course, there was tremendous controversy about the casting, particularly of Lupita Nyong'o, the Kenyan Mexican actress as Helen of Troy. So there has been a lot of excitement and agitation and discussion of, what are the politics of the film. And Catherine, you raised this question about the film depicting a status quo or a contemporary world that's been broken by a forever war. And does that have resonance? I mean, I suppose so. I wonder. I don't know anything about Nolan's politics. There is this element of the film where Nolan has worked in a historical datum, which is that at the end of the Bronze Age, in the late 1200s, early 1100s BCE, there was the advent of these mysterious sea peoples that was associated with the decline of the Bronze Age empires. They got as far as Egypt. And Nolan has this idea that it's actually the returning Greeks, the Greeks returning, Odysseus himself, in fact, who are the destructive sea peoples. I guess you could read a political message into that. My gut feeling is that I didn't feel it was terribly political. I mean, I think many people, I think, have very cleverly and quite rightly seen in this film a kind of sequel to Oppenheimer. In both films, there is a figure who has, as it were, created a weapon of mass destruction, the atom bomb for Oppenheimer and the Trojan horse for Odysseus. And that person is then afflicted by terrible guilt over the destruction that he has unleashed on the world. And I think probably that's as far as Nolan's politics go, as far as I can see. Um, Robert H. asks, is there a precedent for what in the movie is referred to as Zeus's law, which is so important for Nolan's Odyssey in Homer and his contemporaries? So, absolutely, yes. I think if there is one religious, social, and ethical principle that operates in Homer's Odyssey, it is what we call xenia. So the Greek word xenos, interestingly, means both a foreigner and a guest. Um, and xenia is the social institution that demands that strangers who appear on your doorstep, xenoi, uh, it is the root of our word xenophobia, actually, right? The foreigner, fear of the foreigner. There is an absolute imperative that the guest be welcomed. Part of this is because, in this world, you never know whether the person who has shown up on your doorstep is a god in disguise, testing your good nature. And in fact, one of the suitors in the Odyssey points that out when the suitors are abusing Odysseus, who has returned in disguise to his own palace. You never know whether these humble looking beggars who have appeared on your doorstep might be a god. And therefore, there is this institution which is described with great elaborateness throughout the Odyssey. Whenever somebody shows up at somebody's doorstep, you bathe them, you clothe them, you feed them, and only then do you ask, oh, by the way, who are you? And there, Nolan has found a sort of parallel to that. So obviously, he's not going to use the word xenia in a IMAX blockbuster. People would be scratching their heads. So he calls it, I think, very cleverly, Zeus's law. And I think Nolan has done his homework because, in fact, the deity who presides over the fulfillment of this social institution is one of the forms or instantiations of Zeus is Zeus Xenios, Zeus who presides over the correct implementation of xenia, guest-host relationships. And I should point out that, many of us find the end of the Odyssey very brutal. And I've seen many comments of this about this online. The Odysseus slays all 108 suitors, as well as a gaggle of the enslaved maids who have been consorting with the suitors. But the strong implication is that in so doing, according to this morality of Xenia, he is, as odd as it seems to us, righteously avenging the terrible violation of Xenia that the suitors have committed in laying siege to Odysseus's palace and invading it without the invitation of the host. And so, absolutely, Robert, there is a strong precedent, and I like the way that uh, Nolan found a way. I was wondering actually before the movie started, whether he was going to deal with Xenia, which is so important for the morality of the Odyssey. If you don't believe in Xenia, the ending doesn't make any sense. Um, and I like that he called it Zeus's Law. I think the audience caught on very fast that there was something interesting about this. And I will say that uh, Nolan was also hip to the fact, which we recognize, that Odysseus himself violates Xenia when he enters the cave of the Cyclops uninvited and starts eating his food. And, it's part of what makes him, if I may say, a complicated character. Um, Christopher asks, could I expand on the question of guilt? Is there a reason the Homeric tradition couldn't accommodate it? Is it found elsewhere in Homer? Well, there's a lot of discussion of this, but archaic Greek culture is what the anthropologists um, uh, characterize as a shame culture. So guilt is an internalized sense that you have done something wrong. In a shame culture, what you fear most is being embarrassed or exposed as having done something wrong in front of other people. And that is the operative sort of mode of the Homeric mentality. So I just don't think guilt is something that these people experience. I think you act in this culture in such a way as to avoid doing something that makes you look foolish or stupid in public. But that's not the same as guilt. Um, Ian, is asking, what do we think? What do I think of the imposition of Sinon, or Sinon, as he calls him in the film, which is actually a character from Virgil's Aeneid, in the adaptation. So Sinon, Ian goes on to say, is the locus of Odysseus's guilt, um, but it's a departure from Homer's text. So, as I mentioned before, I don't have a problem with this adaptation, this movie adaptation of incorporating elements from another great poet's narration of the fall of Troy. In Book Two of Virgil's Aeneid, in some depth, the poet goes into the mechanics of how the horse was used as a lure for the Trojans to bring this object within the city gates and therefore hasten their own fall. And in the Aeneid, Sinon is a character who has a great role in that story. But it doesn't bother me that Nolan um, imported that from Virgil. What bothered me is that, so again, he has removed a very important scene from the underworld. So in Nolan's movie, the most significant interaction that Odysseus has in when he goes down to the land of the dead, or I shouldn't say down, because actually it's someplace you can go to by boat, like Venice. Um, uh, and he makes Odysseus's encounter with the ghost of this Sinon character, whom we learn early in the film Odysseus has sort of duped into engaging with the Trojans and has not, in fact, revealed what the horse was really about. And in the underworld scene, the the only substantial encounter that Odysseus has is with this Sinon character who reproaches him bitterly for having deceived him, which adds to his sense of guilt, which is the predominant mode for Nolan's Odysseus. And I thought it was a wasted opportunity because, of course, there are two important encounters in Homer's text that take place during the underworld scene. one, which is one of the great moments in all of classical literature, where Odysseus has been invited to sort of uh, 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 make the ghosts rise. And the ghost of his own mother appears before him, Anticlea, who he has been a long he had been gone so long he didn't even know she had died until he sees her ghost in the underworld. And if in a very famous moment he tries three times to embrace, to put his arms around the ghost, but of course there's nothing to embrace. It's one of the great moments in literature, and one that beautifully, I always think, expresses what our relation to the dead, an armful of nothingness. And I was shocked that he omitted that because it's so dramatizable and so cinematic. But of course, Nolan is not interested in the tender moments that Odysseus has. And then, of course, the other great encounter he has in the underworld, which is with the ghost of Achilles, the great hero of the Iliad, the warrior par excellence, who in a very famous speech, Odysseus sees Achilles and he says, "Well, Achilles, you got everything you wanted. People keep talking about how great you were. You died young, but you got everlasting glory." And Achilles ghost responds, "I would rather be the indentured servant of a man of very little means and still be alive than be king of all the dead," which is an incredible validation of Odysseus as a character and the Odyssey as an epic of survival. Odysseus will stoop to anything to stay alive. He doesn't have Achilles. He doesn't subscribe to Achilles' vision of heroism. It's an incredibly important moment. I was shocked that Nolan omitted it, but again, it would have validated both Odysseus and the Odyssey in a way that Nolan wasn't interested in. Um, uh, Francis asks, oh, sorry, no, I already addressed that question. I'll go to a question by Matt M. I wonder if that's my brother Matt, who's watching this evening. Daniel, can you address the dad issue? Is that a dumb translation or valid? Oh, it says, "Love your brother Matt." Hi, Matt. Um, so one of the disputes that arose when the um, trailer started to drop was some people very outraged that Tom Holland refers to Odysseus as dad, which they found to be terribly anachronistic. And of course, there were many complaints that all the actors speak with American accents. That bothered some people as well, because as we all know, the ancient Greeks and Romans spoke actually with British accents. Um, so about the dad thing, actually, I don't think it's a problem. There is a word in Homeric Greek, ata, which is an affectionate nickname for a father. The word for father is pater, but Telemachus does use this word ata, not of Odysseus, who, remember, he doesn't know and has never known, so there is not an affectionate relationship between them. But I think very shrewdly on Homer's part, he uses it of Eumaeus, the loyal swineherd, who it is made very clear in the text has become a sort of father figure to this young man. And so I have no problem with that, because I think in my translation, I translate Atta as Papa, which I thought was kind of charming. So I have no problem with the dad thing. And if, the next time you're at a cocktail party and people are complaining about the fact that Tom Holland says dad, you can dazzle them and tell them about Atta. So I think it's not anachronistic. And I think it's quite true to Homer's text, although Homer deploys it in the right way by having Telemachus use it of Eumaeus. He's telling you something about the deep affection that he has developed for this older father figure who is not, in fact, his father. Um, let's see. Thoughts on the ending of the movie. which seems to borrow from Tennyson's Ulysses. That's Douglas. It's an excellent question. In, at the end of Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus slays all the suitors. Then the outraged kin of the suitors march on Ithaca, on the palace, to get violent vengeance. A battle is about to begin until Athena, Odysseus's patroness, and Zeus put an end to the action, and they say, "Basta! We're not going to start the Iliad again. No more battles." Um, Nolan does, I think, borrow from Tennyson's Ulysses, which, of course, ends with Tennyson's Ulysses is part of a tradition of interpretations or approaches to the Odyssey, um, which romanticize Odysseus's wanderings and turn him into a figure of longing that, in fact, he doesn't want to come home. Tennyson's poem Ulysses, very famous, um, presents us with an Odysseus who has finally come home and he finds, the natives are a little clunky and stupid. Telemachus is a dutiful kid, but not so interesting. He's ready to hit the road again. And in Nolan's version, I do think he picked that up because he has Odysseus sort of, I think, stained by the crime of the murder of the suitors, haunted by guilt, is going to go head west toward the Pillars of Heracles into the setting sun to make some kind of amends for all of the terrible things that he's done. So I absolutely, Douglas, I absolutely think that um, uh, he has taken a leaf from Tennyson. I should say as well that the Alexandrian Greek poet Constantine Cavafy, whom I translated as well, in his poem, which is quite well known at this point, Ithaca, takes a leaf from Tennyson, and many people read the poem as an endorsement of that idea that it's the journey, not the destination, that life is about. So I do think, Douglas, that Nolan was affected by that and used that. And Maureen asks, how do you view the whitewashing of Odysseus's sexual and near sexual relationships throughout his journey? Is this something Nolan isn't interested in, a desire to appeal to family audiences, or a desire to make him seem more faithful and thus more deserving of Penelope's faithfulness than he really is, or would have been expected during Homer's time? It's a good question, and I was just reading um, Emily Wilson's, my fellow translator Emily Wilson's scathing uh, uh, review, I guess you could call it, of the movie that just appeared in the London Review of Books, in which she complained. I think at the very end she says, "There's no sex and the food looks terrible," was certainly not true of Homer on either score. The food always seems fantastic in Homer. I always sort of find my stomach rumbling when I was translating those passages about giant, cuts of meat roasting on open fires. I do think, all kidding aside, Maureen, that many people have talked about the fact that there is no sex in the movie, and it is certainly something that's happening in Homer. Odysseus has had a sexual relationship with the nymph Calypso for 7 years. We are told that he has long since tired of her, which is interesting because it suggests that, maybe in the first weeks or months when he was washed up on her island as a shipwrecked nobody, he was enjoying it, but not so much anymore. And that we're told as well that she forces him to make love to her every night, even though his heart isn't in it anymore. I must say that's a passage my students never quite can wrap their heads around. And he hooks up as well with Circe, in Book 10, makes love memorably to Penelope when they're finally reunited. So why does he do this? First of all, I think, again, Nolan is hell-bent on stripping away from the Odyssey every element of fun, charm, and sexuality as well. There's an overall kind of drabness in the vision, which is deeply un-Homeric. Odysseus is a sexy guy. I mean, it doesn't mean, I'm not one of these people who says, he's 100% perfect, but he clearly has a great deal of appeal. And Nolan is very invested in sort of taking away from Odysseus everything that makes him appealing or edgy in the original. I I I don't think it's because he's afraid it will offend family audiences. I mean, there's enough violence in the movie to, offend a family-minded audience. So I don't think it's about that. I'm interested, Maureen, in your idea that it's meant to make him look more faithful and therefore more deserving of Penelope's, much touted faithfulness. I think that's probably true. I hadn't thought of that, and I think it's a good idea. I would stress too that the sexual morality of the time would not have seen Odysseus's dalliances with these goddesses as unfaithful. It was par for the course. And I mean, certainly in the Odyssey, those dalliances are not in any way felt to detract from the fact, which is obviously a fact in the text, that there is only one woman for him, and that is Penelope. And a lot of the poem, and particularly the last part of the poem, consists of demonstrations of why she is, in fact, the match for him. Um, uh, and here's an interesting question uh, from Daniel. I'm guessing that's Daniel Blatt, a regular in our New York Review seminars, who said he was disappointed with Calypso. My disappointment relates to what Nolan did with all the divine characters, except for Circe. What do you make of the de-divinization? Well, absolutely. I do think it's so. I'm in two minds about this. I mean, when I saw the movie the first time at the press screening, I thought to take away the gods was a problem because in the Odyssey is framed and its action determined by the intervention of two gods, Athena in particular, who, as I mentioned, is his divine patroness, and Zeus, who runs the whole family business. And the Odyssey opens with a conversation between those two gods saying it's time to get Odysseus home. Odysseus's wanderings are in large part caused by the irate sea god Poseidon, whose son is the Cyclops, whom Odysseus had blinded, and that is the cause. It is to avenge the blinding of the Cyclops that Poseidon makes Odysseus's journey, homecoming journey, so difficult. And the Odyssey, as I just mentioned, ends with Athena and Zeus once again. It's a wonderful symmetry determining that it's time to wrap up the action. Uh, so I think to sort of strip that away uh, sort of rewrites the ethics of the original. I was particularly disappointed with the representation of Calypso. So you have to remember in Homer, Calypso and Circe are both divine. They're nymphs. They're immortal goddesses. And as I mentioned, I thought the Circe scene was very effective, although the Circe that we get is a kind of Wiccan figure rather than a glittering, gorgeous goddess. But I think Calypso in particular, I was disappointed in. Maybe not so, she's clearly not a goddess, although you do wonder what she's been doing floating around that island all the time with nobody to talk to. Um, which is not a question that poses itself if she's actually a goddess. What had disappointed me about the Calypso was not so much the de-divinization, although I think that's a problem because, as I mentioned, the whole point of that episode is she offers him immortality, which only a goddess can do, and he says no because he wants Penelope, not Calypso. But I thought Calypso in the Odyssey, Nolan is not great at female characters. I think this is a known thing, and it's a problem particularly in the Odyssey, which is a text renowned among ancient Greek texts for its interest in and brilliant representation of female figures, both divine and mortal. I was disappointed in Calypso because in the Odyssey, she's a figure of great rhetorical power. She has one of the most famous speeches in Homer when Zeus sends down Hermes, the messenger god, to tell her, time's up, you have to let this guy go home. And she gives a famous and brilliant speech attacking the male double standard for female sexual behavior. She says, you gods get to sleep with mortal women, but whenever one of us goddesses takes a mortal male lover, you always get rid of him. And I thought to sort of deprive her of that and to make her into this sort of, new age therapist administering drugs to her patient, I thought that was very flat-footed and a real shame. And I think it was a shame um, to do that to the actress who could have done, so much more with it. Um, all right, we're nearing our time. As my regulars know, I'm always happy to uh, uh, go long, but we are nearing our 8 o'clock mark. So here's a question from CU. You sort of touched on this, but would love to hear more. As you mentioned, myth is a playground. How much creative freedom we should or could give to the adapter as long as it evokes the similar sense of awe. I thought casting Travis Scott and using rap music as modern stand-in for oral poetry was brilliant, but people seem to be offended by that. Oh, well, so I think this is a great note to start ending on, and it brings me back to the question that I ended my introductory remarks with. What does it mean to adapt something? So actually, you'll see if you read my review in the New York Review of Books, I too love the idea of using Travis Scott as the figure of the court poet in the Ithacan royal court, who's the resident bard with whom the movie opens. Phemius is the name. I know a lot of people think he's supposed to be Demodocus, the court poet of the Phaeacians, but in fact it's Phemius, the house bard on Ithaca. And I thought that was brilliant, a brilliant way to evoke what we know were the oral, improvisational origins of epic poetry. We believe these epics began as improvised oral recitations that kept morphing, the way that a wiki uh, keeps being added to by people. And so I thought that was a genius way to put across the idea. So I'm very for me, what makes an adaptation interesting is when one uses the sort of tools available in the modern era to put across a sense of something essential to the ancient era. So I think the Travis Scott idea was brilliant. We see him sort of wrapping the Troy story. He starts out by saying a face, a ship. Um, and I think audiences got it. And so that kind of thing I admire. And as I mentioned before, I'm not interested in getting the armor right. People are complaining about Agamemnon's armor and the ships was a Viking ship and not a Greek ship. That doesn't matter. Uh, I do think, as I mentioned, that this film, to my mind, does not succeed as an adaptation of Homer's Odyssey. As I said, it just uses the outline, but so completely alters the character of the main character as to make him unrecognizable. So at what point are you just creating something totally new? And as I mentioned, I thought it would have been maybe better not to call it the Odyssey, And just as that other film did, to call it The Return, so thereby alluding to an important theme of the Odyssey without claiming to represent it. I think if you call your movie The Odyssey, people are expecting the Odyssey. And as I mentioned, what makes it not the Odyssey is not that they got the clothes wrong or that, Telemachus keeps wearing sleeves, which Greeks would have been horrified by, but it doesn't bring across the soul of this epic as I understand it. And for me, that was the real problem, the real failure. Or I don't even want to use the word failure. I just think it became something else. And I should say, so people are going to say, well, he did the same thing with Batman. And that's absolutely true. He took Batman, who actually is a dark character in the original comics, which I read voraciously in my childhood with my brothers. Um, but I think, the problem with the Odyssey, or let me say, the thing about the Odyssey is the stakes are much, much higher. You're talking about one of the foundational, texts of our civilization. And I think for that reason, people are much more deeply invested, in it. And I've been reading the online commentary. I've been engaging people, um, and and I'm not always agreeing. Nolan can do whatever he wants. This is his vision, blah, blah, blah. But as I said, with my analogy to the Moby Dick with the soft, cuddly Ahab feeling bad about killing whales, at a certain point, and I think that is a very good analogy, although I offer it, with a raised eyebrow. I think that's exactly what Nolan has done. He's completely changed the main character, given him a completely different set of motivations. And so what are you left with? You're left with an outline with very different um, contents. And so I think I think that's a problem. I'm going to come to an end now, although I am told by our moderator, Chandler Fritz, that the top upvoted question, which I have been avoiding scrupulously, is what is your take on Emily Wilson's review? Which I mentioned before, and I'll close with this. Um, I I have to say I was sort of a little bit shocked, mostly because I think it's quite well known that Nolan, for now a year and a half in advance, said that he had been using Emily Wilson's translation, had made his cast read her translation before the filming. Although I was very happy to find out from the New Yorker this week that John Leguizamo was reading my translation. Um, and that, hers and all of ours translations have received a tremendous boost by the movie. Obviously, copies of everyone's translations are flying off the shelves. So I did think it was a little odd to sort of bite the hand that feeds you so viciously. She said I would be ashamed to have written this script. I don't know. It seemed a little over the top. I actually have seen comments that Emily Wilson made about the film, which really overlap with mine. Basically, her critique totally almost overlaps with mine. She objected to the same omissions and elisions as I did, but I do think she could have done it in a nicer way, given that she's gotten a lot of benefits from Nolan's movie. Anyway, in the chat, there's a link to my review in case you are interested in reading it. And there's also a link if you're interested in watching. We had a very lively, wonderful New York Review seminar, a six-week seminar on Homer's Odyssey. And as I mentioned, there is a 25% discount for people who have signed up for tonight's session. And there's a link to that as well. So thank you for these terrific questions. And I hope I've answered or addressed the concerns of many of you. And I'll hope also to see you some of you this fall when we start my five-part series, each part focusing on a different text or group of texts on the theme, which goes back to the ancient Greeks, but we've all experienced it ourselves, of unrequited love. So thank you very much and have a good evening.